A woman in a lemon-yellow headscarf stood outside the hospital's metal gate just before dawn, one palm pressed to the iron as if the door itself could steady her. Her name was Miriam, a street vendor who sold roasted groundnuts near the bus stand, and the boy gasping against her hip was her son, Idris. He had been clipped by a motorbike, the wheel slicing his calf, the fall stealing the air from his chest and replacing it with panic. She had a folded wad of crumpled francs in her blouse and a plastic bag of oranges in her basket, which, more than once that morning, she mistook for the weight of hope. The security guard, familiar with hurried mothers and midnight dramas, unlatched the gate and waved her through with a tired kindness. Beyond, the compound stirred awake, a flicker of fluorescent tubes, a broom against concrete, the antiseptic sting of chlorinated water. The smell of the ward was plain and earnest the way morning bread is. It made a person believe in beginnings. Inside, the hallway made a corridor of light. An orderly in a faded green badge rolled a mop bucket past, nodding at Miriam. A triage nurse named Awa, who had learned to spot trouble from 20 paces, saw the boy's lips blanching and moved with that bilateral clarity nurses have. One hand already reaching for the oxygen mask, the other finding the pulse with 2 fingers like a prayer. When the pulse came back staccato and thin, she gave the mask to Idris and ushered them toward the ward where curtains swayed like patient lungs. In that first minute, you could feel the old promise of medicine reassert itself. Breath first, questions later. The boy's eyes searched the ceiling tiles. He found constellations there and tried to anchor himself to the square patterns. Then the system arrived in the shape of a glass window. A cashier's booth, tucked at the edge of the corridor like a booth for tickets at a gray cinema, and at its center an opening no larger than a book. The sign above it, hammered crooked by some hurried hand, read, "Admissions and Deposits." A clerk slid his chair closer and tapped the edge of his ledger with a ballpoint pen. The pen tapped again, loud enough to be counted. Awa felt it like a cough in a quiet chapel. She kept the oxygen mask steady and called over her shoulder for a trolley. The clerk cleared his throat. He asked for the deposit receipt. Awa didn't answer. She signaled to an orderly, but the boy needed sutures and a doctor's eye. The clerk repeated himself. Procedure required a deposit for non-life-threatening injuries, he explained, which the chart would determine. The chart was laminated and hung by a string. It made small rules look enormous. Miriam reached into her blouse for her money and found how thin it was when unfolded in air. She glanced at the oranges and did the math that mothers do. Awa met her eyes and saw a calculation older than policy, whether to beg, borrow, or refuse. The clerk, who was decent in other rooms, tightened into his role because roles ask for stubbornness. He gestured at the door to the fee office, where a second sign waited. No treatment without receipt. The words were hard metal. They cut even before they touched skin. The boy's breath stuttered beneath the mask. Awa whispered that the only gate that mattered was the airway. The clerk, sweating now, said he would lose his job if he broke protocol. At the end of the corridor, a doctor glanced up from a tablet, hesitated at the sound of policy being spoken in a raised tone, then glanced back down, an old habit of survival in a place where paper could outrank breath. Outside, a motorcycle backfired. Everyone's shoulders flinched a fraction. Inside, Awa lifted Idris onto the trolley that finally arrived and began to wheel him toward the treatment bay. The clerk called after them. The corridor felt longer than it had a moment before. The door to the treatment room stood open, but the word receipt floated like a chain across the threshold. The wound was visible now, blood like a dark river down a small leg. And yet the system's wound was quieter and nearer to the heart. A book that must be balanced, a ledger that must be appeased. The boy's breath steadied under the mask, then faltered again, and in that falter was the whole country's story. Someone takes breath, a door appears, a ledger speaks. This is how a day begins, when rules have learned to forget why they were written. By the time the trolley reached the bay, the clerk had already stepped away from his window and the air smelled of both disinfectant and delay, which is to say, it smelled of a test. Awa fixed the mask and told Miriam to keep talking to her son so he would stay anchored. The boy blinked and obeyed. Somewhere, someone stamped the morning's first receipt. Somewhere else, a gate considered closing. The day had started. The stakes were already counting. In the treatment bay, the wall clock's second hand clicked with mechanical indifference, indifferent to blood type, indifferent to policy. Awa threaded a cannula with the same calm she used when teaching trainees to tie shoes. She promised Idris a story about a schoolyard goalkeeper who swallowed fear and caught a ball like a moon. Miriam nodded as if stories carried oxygen. At the bay entrance, the obstructive official took shape in a man named Bako, senior accounts officer, his badge perfectly aligned on his pocket. He carried the ledger like a gospel book, and the printed memorandum like a blade wrapped in paper. Bako had a reputation for never misplacing a franc, and for returning pencils to the exact jar they came from. He was not cruel by nature. He was baptized by rules. He stood where he could be seen and announced the memorandum once more, as if repetition could heal the wound it created. He said the deposit rule had been tightened after an audit revealed revenue leakage. Leakage made healthcare sound like a jug rather than a lifeline. The memo cited Clause 7.4 of the hospital's cost recovery policy, cross-referenced with a ministry circular from a year when riots had not yet found their way to the pharmacy shelves. Bako, a father of two, had seen what happened to colleagues who bent rules. They became stories told in low voices that ended with the phrase, "sat at home." He did not want to sit at home. He wanted the numbers to add up, the lines to be short, the board to mark him as compliant. He did not want to be the bad person in someone else's narration, which is how bad persons start. Awa kept her attention on the child's breath, the untidy rhythm being its own language. She asked for a doctor again. The doctor arrived, a compact woman with steady wrists and grief tucked away under her collar. She examined the wound and prepared the suture tray. Bako cleared his throat, as if to join the medical team. He read the memo aloud and placed it on the counter where instruments gleamed. The doctor's face shifted an eighth of an inch. She asked if the boy's case had been classified as life-threatening. Bako said the triage score was not yet logged. Awa, who had already read the child's breath with her hands, said the score could be logged after his oxygen returned from ragged to even. Bako pointed at the wall where, freshly mounted, a poster glared, "Without receipt, no service." Miriam found her voice inside the old habit of market bargaining. She told Bako she would pay after the boy could walk again. She would pay with the oranges, with tomorrow morning's sales, with whatever pride she had left that could be exchanged. Bako did not look at her, not because he was unkind, but because he knew that looking would make his roll melt. He read another line. The doctor read the boy's leg and saw the cut wasn't arterial. She threaded the needle and asked Awa to hold the skin taut. The refusal to bow to pressure in that moment took shape, not as a slogan, but as the continuing of motion. Awa held. The doctor stitched. Bako's voice tried to thread itself through their work and failed. At the fifth stitch, the oxygen hiss grew less frantic. At the seventh, Idris opened his eyes long enough to find the doctor's face and memorize it like a stamp. The ward filled with whispers. Another mother leaned in the doorway, clutching a file of receipts like a shield. A porter murmured that the accounts people were going to make a case out of this one. Someone's phone buzzed with the telegram group message. "They're doing it again, refusing before receipt." Someone else filmed with their camera low. The rumor of a video is a kind of witness now. Bako saw this shift in the ward, the attention moving toward him, and he tried to reclaim the center by invoking a larger name. The ministry. "Orders from above," he said. Awa looked above, to the dusty fan and the water stain on the ceiling, and found no ministry there. The doctor finished the 9th stitch, then the 10th, and reminded everyone that breath is the highest protocol. It could have ended as a small quarrel in the long, weary list of quarrels that flavor a system where scarcity teaches its own theology. But at the door stood a young aide with a notebook and a cheap pen, the ink staining his fingers like proof. His name was Salif, assigned to the district chair as a pair of ears on corridors like these. He had come to check on something unrelated, an inventory glitch, but he saw the memo on the counter, the wound in a child's leg, the sign that turned a door into a gate, and he saw a story that would fill a dashboard cell in a way numbers could not. He took a breath, as if steadying himself for deeper water. Outside, a siren wailed and then fell silent, like the world clearing its throat to introduce a different kind of mourning. The child's breathing returned to a rhythm that could bear sentences. Bako adjusted his badge. Awa peeled off her gloves. The doctor asked for the file. The gate trembled between old habit and new courage. Somewhere in the city, a man named Ibrahim looked at his calendar and decided to walk, unannounced, to the hospital. He arrived without convoy, in a plain khaki shirt that still held the crease of an iron. The cuffs rolled as if ready for work that used hands. Ibrahim chaired the district council. In other places, they called him the leader, but he preferred the simplicity of his given name in corridors that insisted on titles. The guard at the gate recognized him from a town hall and firmed his stance into an awkward salute. Ibrahim nodded once and entered. He walked as people do who learned early that doors open if you touch them with respect and intent. On the way from the gate to the ward, he noticed small things and gave them names quietly to himself. A broken bench, a flickering tube light, a life-size poster with a smile too white to be real. He kept a log in his head, not because he wanted to fault find, but because good logs, unlike ledgers, can redeem days. In the treatment bay foyer, the air changed the way it does when a new temperature meets old pressure. Awa recognized him immediately, not because of his office, but because of the way aides defer to leaders with their whole bodies. She did not curtsy or perform. She called him by the honorific Sir once, and then used his name. The boy dozed with the relief of exhaustion. Miriam clutched the bed rail and watched Ibrahim like a person watches weather. Bako stepped forward, memorandum in hand. He began with a phrase that had saved many frightened officials before him. "With respect, sir, we are following policy." Ibrahim listened the way people do when listening is an instrument. He touched the edge of the memo and felt, beneath paper and ink, a more ancient grain. Fear dressed up as procedure. He asked who wrote the sign. He asked when the last serious case had been delayed by a cashier's window. He asked whether the deposit rule applied to oxygen. The questions were not traps. They were doors. The answers came haltingly, each one pulling on a thread that led to a tangle you could name if you weren't afraid of the noise it would make. The doctor explained that emergencies were supposed to override the rule, but ambiguity in the clause made triage timid on busy nights. Awa spoke of an unspoken practice. Hold a patient at the edge of help until the receipt arrives to keep the auditors calm. Bako described leakage with a reverence that sounded almost pious. He said targets were assigned, soft targets, but targets still, for daily receipts to keep pharmacy shelves stocked. Ibrahim nodded, once for the shelves and once for the boy's breath. He did not moralize. He took out his phone and opened the Notes app with lines already labeled gait, breath, ledger. Salif, the aide with ink-stained fingers, stepped near. He had photographs stored, the sign, the memo, the ledger page with blank lines waiting like quiet threats. He spoke softly into Ibrahim's shoulder and told him about a WhatsApp group where nurses swapped strategies to outmaneuver the booth without losing their jobs. He mentioned earlier videos. He spoke the name of a grandmother who had sat too long last month with a fractured hip because her nephew's transfer didn't clear on time. Ibrahim listened, then asked Bako if he had children. The question startled the room. Bako said yes, a boy and a girl. Ibrahim asked whether, if his own boy lay on a gurney, he would want the sutures now or after the receipt. Bako said now, of course now. He held the memo a little closer to his chest, as if to protect it from its own logic. Ibrahim took a breath that changed things. He said the district would pilot a simple protocol beginning today, here, before noon. He said it in the same voice one uses to confirm that water boils or that morning comes. Treat first, bill later, he said. He named it the First Breath Protocol because words need a hook to hold onto people who have been taught to float between memos. He told Bako that no one would lose their job for obeying breath. He told the doctor she now had the authority to annotate a case in one sentence. First breath, and that this one sentence would unlock drugs, sutures, scans. He told Awa that the triage clock now faced the treatment bay, not the cashier's window. He looked at Miriam and said the deposit would be sorted, as deposits often are, once the earth stopped spinning in her head. The corridor had been listening. When he finished, the quiet did not feel like doubt. It felt like ground settling after rain. Bako's hand fell from the memo. The doctor's face softened in a way that made the fluorescent light look kind. Awa breathed out through her nose and felt the old training return. Airway, breathing, circulation, and realized how long she had been swimming against a current whose source she'd never been allowed to see. Ibrahim asked for a room with a table and a wall where something could be hung permanently. He said someone should bring the admissions ledger, not to shame it, but to name where it belongs. He said policy is a door. If we oil the hinges, it opens. He said the gate must stop confusing income with life. And then he smiled briefly at Salif and said to get the chalk and the tape and to find a blank wall where a city could come and see itself in numbers that honored breath. Before noon, he repeated, and the clock agreed. They made a room out of a storage closet with a window that caught the street's honest noise. Salif set a table by the wall and peeled off a poster advertising a health fair from 2 years ago. The tape leaving a pale rectangle like the shadow of an old mistake. Ibrahim sat at the table with his notebook and his phone light on, as if one handheld lamp could invite truth into corners where it had learned to be shy. Bako arrived with the admissions ledger, spine cracked from use, and paused at the threshold, the way a man might hesitate before entering a church in dirty boots. Awa came with a stack of triage forms, the edges curled from humid nights. The doctor brought the laminated memo and a dry erase marker. Miriam sat on a chair outside the door within earshot, her son asleep at last, breath folding and unfolding like a small sail. They began by naming the gate. On a large sheet of butcher paper taped to the wall, Ibrahim drew a rectangle with a slit at the bottom and wrote cashier booth above it. He then drew a bed and wrote bedside. Between them, he sketched a door. Above the door, he wrote breath. The simplicity embarrassed everyone into honesty. Salif cued screenshots on his phone of WhatsApp messages. Nurses asking colleagues to loan a receipt number to get an IV started. A message from a junior doctor at 2:11 a.m. pleading for an exception for a child with an asthma attack. A reply from accounts at 2:23 a.m. A single line that read, "Policy is policy." The timestamps formed their own sentence. Ibrahim asked for patterns. Awa pointed to Fridays, when pay packets thinned and receipts took longer to appear. Bako, reluctantly at first, turned the ledger so that others could see and traced with his finger. The days where revenue spikes matched festival weekends and the nights when it dipped because fear did the accounting. They read Clause 7.4 aloud. It did not say what people had said. It asked for deposits before non-urgent care. It asked for triage to decide, but triage had been colonized by caution. Ambiguity had become a broker, collecting its invisible fee in quiet delays. Salif wrote "broker of ambiguity" on the butcher paper and circled it. The phrase shifted the mood. This wasn't about good people and bad people. It was about a bad mechanism that made decent people into gatekeepers against their will. Ibrahim asked for 1 week's logs of complaints. The hospital's receptionist, a woman whose patience was a civic treasure, produced a bound notebook with a plastic cover, pages Coke-bottled with carbon copy. They sifted the notes. Here was a mother noting a 35-minute wait for oxygen cannula because the cashier had gone to pray. Here was a father whose mobile transfer failed twice because the signal had dipped. Here a neighbor, not related, writing in block letters that he had seen enough doors in his life and didn't need another one on the way to help. Exposure needs artifacts. So they put the artifacts on the wall in a grid, memo, ledger page, complaint paragraph, WhatsApp screenshot. They did not blow them up with spectacle. They let the smallness of the paper convict the system by contrast. Ibrahim asked Bako about targets. Bako confessed the existence of soft targets. An internal email, never called a target but felt as one, urging departments to meet daily thresholds to secure supply continuity. Ibrahim asked how often the target sat heavier than triage. Bako said often enough. He said it with the shame of a man who knows his faith and his fear share a drawer. They named the perverse incentive plainly. They marked it in chalk as if marking a cracked step that needed mending. Salif called the district's newly minted governance unit and requested an auditor, not the punitive kind, but the kind who enjoys fixing drains. The auditor arrived by motorbike with dust on his shoes and curiosity in his smile. He asked for stamps, for email printouts, for the meeting minutes where the deposit rule became religion. He found a spreadsheet on an office computer titled Revenue Assurance, columns tidy as a marching band, with a conditional format that turned cells red when targets weren't met. Red cells made people feel watched. The auditor selected a few cells and asked the owner of the sheet what happened on red days. The owner said calls were made, questions were asked, names were spoken in rooms where air conditioning kept sweat from revealing guilt. Then came the naming of the antidote. Ibrahim wrote first breath in block letters and placed it where the memo had been, a quiet dethronement. He wrote treat first, bill later beneath it, and below that drew 3 blank cells for numbers that would be filled before the day ended. The cells carried their own promise of future boredom. Door to help minutes. Denials in last 24 hours. Complaints resolved. Awa asked what counted as help. Ibrahim said oxygen, a cannula, a suture, a bedsheet, a voice saying you are not alone. Bako made a small sound that could have been dissent or relief. He asked how they would keep shelves stocked. Ibrahim said the district would ring-fence an emergency fund drawn from a small levy on non-emergency imaging, paid by people who could pay without choosing between medicine and food. The auditor nodded and added a line item to a draft budget on his pad. Shelves would live. Breath would not pay the shelf tax. They drafted a complaint channel that did not punish whistleblowers, a WhatsApp number printed in large, honest digits, with a promised response within 24 hours. An SLA that birthed consequences. If an oxygen delay above 10 minutes occurred, the unit had explained it to a committee of peers, not to a solitary superior whose mood could be bought by a memo. Salif suggested a monthly open board where the numbers were read aloud under the same fan that had watched delays for years. Ibrahim said yes, and not just read, explained and not just explained, owned. They agreed the dashboard would be mounted in the corridor by the cashier's booth, as if to make peace between the ledger and breath. And because exposure without follow-through is theater, they signed a 1-page order with a stamp borrowed from the receptionist, the ink smudging like an oath made under real conditions. They re-entered the ward with a paper, and the door they had drawn on the butcher sheet felt larger, more oiled, less like an obstacle and more like a passage. In the boy's bed, the rise and fall of his chest answered the question policy had been asking badly for years. At noon, the corridor gathered as if market and mosque had agreed on a joint appointment. The new board was a simple sheet of painted plywood, the paint still faintly sweet, the grid lines taped with care by Salif's steady hand. Awa stood with the dry erase marker, Bako with the ledger under his arm, not as a weapon, but as a record ready to be reconciled with life. The doctor held the one-page order. Ibrahim addressed no crowds, only the corridor. He said systems are made of doors and breath and ledgers. The order matters. He said the first breath protocol was not poetry, but plumbing. He pointed to the 3 boxes and called them the hospital's new habit. A child recovered in a bed within earshot. No one asked him to perform hope for the camera. The protocol itself was embarrassingly simple. Triage stamped first breath on cases requiring immediate aid. A rubber stamp with letters in relief. Red ink that stains and reminds. Any staff member could invoke it in good faith. The cashier's window was instructed to accept post-treatment payments for stamped cases, logging them as receivable in a new column whose existence changed everything. The emergency fund, seeded that afternoon by a council-approved transfer from the district's discretionary pot, covered shortfalls. A QR code on the wall linked to a tiny website built by Salif's cousin, a student who loved clean fonts. The site displayed door-to-help minutes, denials, and last 24 hours, and complaints resolved with small spark lines that anyone could read over tea. Bako trained his team to enter a timestamp from the moment a patient crossed the gate to the moment of first aid. Awa trained orderlies to ask one question at the door: what happened? And to write the time on the patient's forearm with a pen if the power died. The doctor convened a drill that afternoon. 3 stretchers, 1 oxygen cylinder, 1 missing receipt, 1 timer. They ran it twice. The second run was shorter by 9 minutes. The embarrassment of the first time did its quiet teaching. Ban the perverse incentive, Ibrahim had said, so they did more than whisper it. The revenue assurance sheet lost its red cells. Targets for cashier intake were replaced with targets for door-to-help minutes. Everyone could see the switch had teeth. Unit bonuses, modest but meaningful, would be tied to time saved rather than coins collected. The auditor documented it in a memo so clear it was almost kind. Pharmacy inventory would be buffered by the emergency fund and replenished weekly through an automated purchase order capped by the council's budget ceiling. Finance loved the rhythm. Predictability quieted their ghosts. In the same breath, they outlawed the shadow practice of holding patients hostage to receipts. The order named it directly, naming quiet crimes so that quiet could finally be used for rest. Accountability moved like water through new channels. Complaints via WhatsApp pinged a small triage committee composed of a nurse, a clerk, and a patient advocate nominated by the community council. 24 hours to reply, 72 to resolve or escalate. The dashboard carried the record of that promise, the way a wall carries the memory of hands. Monthly, a culture check was held in the courtyard. Ordinary workers spoke first, managers last. A brazier steamed with mint tea. Someone brought hard biscuits. They read numbers aloud, then folded stories into them. A night when the generator failed and the first breath stamp became the permission to improvise. A morning when a cashier walked a mother to the bed rather than the window and discovered the lightness of a different pride. The few who abused the new trust were handled with a blend of firmness and care. One porter tried to sell the stamp like a shortcut and found himself in a disciplinary meeting where the room held him at length until he understood this was not a trick but a covenant. A mid-level supervisor who threatened a nurse for invoking first breath in a gray area case was made to sit in front of his team and listen to the child's father say thank you. It was not humiliation, it was repair. When a vendor offered Bako a private kickback to restore intake targets, Bako said no aloud, because sometimes systems need sentences said aloud to become real. He wrote the offer down, sent it to the auditor, and slept better that night than he had slept in months. The media, when they came, found little spectacle beyond clean numbers and bored staff who liked their jobs better now. Ibrahim refused to boast on camera. He stood by the board where the spark lines rose and fell like steady breathing, and asked a reporter if they would film the clerk changing the markers each morning. Because that was the story. A new habit making a corridor feel less like a gate and more like a road. On the first Friday after the reform, the door-to-help median was 6 minutes. On the second, it was 5. The board recorded 2 denials in 10 days, and then the next week, 0. Complaints resolved in under 72 hours reached 92% by the end of the month. No brass band played. Awa brought a tray of ground nuts from Miriam's stand to the culture check. the bag warm in her palm. The doctor, who had once kept grief under her collar, let it out as laughter lightly, like air from a balloon you no longer need to grip. Ibrahim watched not as a hero, but as a caretaker of hinges. The district council ratified the protocol with a unanimous vote written in boring minutes. The policy had learned to serve breath. The ledger, appeased by clarity, went quiet. The gate found it could still be a door. By the season's turn, the first breath stamp looked ordinary, the way a school bell looks ordinary until you've known the years without it. The board's grid became background, updated by habit, while the corridor did its daily traffic. In the mornings, Awa wiped the whiteboard with a tissue and wrote new numbers without ceremony. Bako took his tea beside the board and, sometimes absent-mindedly, touched the edge of the plywood as if checking a child's forehead for fever. The doctor kept suturing with the same steady wrists, though now her voice loosened easily into the kind of banter that builds teams. Miriam returned once with a jar of roasted groundnuts, Idris shy behind her leg, the scar on his calf a pale line that claimed no tragedy. She told Awa business was better when she could speak about the hospital without lowering her voice, and that word of mouth is the oldest advertisement that heals. The habit bled outward the way good things do, not with thunder, but with copy paper. The registry office down the road mounted its own board, trading the stamp for a rule called First Document. No bribe, clear queue. IDs issued in a week. The school adopted a first lesson rule, which meant children without uniforms sat in the front row instead of the back, and someone called their parents later to settle fees. The bus depot tried a first seat protocol. Pregnant women and elders sat before tickets were checked, and found fights reduced enough to hear people speak kindly again. Each gate in the town looked at its own doors, its own ledgers, its own breath equivalents, and asked the boring question, what comes first when humans are at stake? Maintenance, the unsung poetry of change, took its place in the calendar. On the first Wednesday of every month, Salif sent out a one-page summary. Median door to help minutes, denials, complaint closures. The spark lines did not spike. They hummed. Once, a week of heavy rains knocked out mobile networks and the WhatsApp complaint line flagged. They switched to a paper box at the door and a phone tree, not elegant but honest, and resolved what needed resolving. Once, a new junior accounts officer, eager to prove zeal, printed a sign that sounded too much like the old sign. The older cashier set it aside and, without fanfare, explained how to measure pride differently now. People corrected people. The policy had become culture. Ibrahim's role shrank the way good leadership should, becoming part of the furniture. He still walked the corridor occasionally, hands in pockets, listening for squeaks. He asked the same questions with fewer words. He praised a clean logbook and a well-placed chair. He sat in the culture checks at the edge and left early, so that the meeting belonged to the people who carried the corridor on their backs. In council sessions, when other districts asked what magic trick he had used, he spoke about doors and breath and ledgers and the order you speak them. He said the reform's genius was its smallness. He said the boredom was the true measure. He refused medals because metal never healed a hinge. Once, late in the afternoon, he stood by the board as sunlight slid across the corridor and turned the chalk lines warm. A boy with a fresh bandage limp-skipped past, humming the hook of a popular song. Awa leaned in the doorway and sipped tea. Bako argued cheerfully with the supplier about the price of syringes, the ledger now a tool instead of a tyrant. The doctor coaxed a toddler to open her mouth and say, "Ah," with the promise of a sticker. Miriam, on her way to the bus stand, paused outside the gate, not as a supplicant, but as a neighbor checking in, and then moved on because she had a living to make and a son to remind to wash behind his ears. The gate swung on its oiled hinges and made no sound. In the small governance office, the auditor pinned another month's summary to a corkboard. The spark lines made a horizon. The phrase broker of ambiguity, circled months earlier, had become a joke you told to ward off curses. When someone new joined the hospital staff, they learned the sequence on day one. Breath before ledger, door before gate. They learned where the stamp lived and how sometimes the best decision is the one that allows you to keep looking people in the eye. The WhatsApp line buzzed less and less, but when it did, you could hear the speed of the reply and the calm of the voice that answered. The city, which had long learned to survive by shortcuts, began enjoying the long, straight road of ordinary competence. Market women sent voice notes to sisters in other towns, advising them to ask for first breath when they needed it. Men in tailors' shops repeated the phrase out of context because it made their mouths feel honest. Children drew boards and stamps in exercise books when asked to sketch a hospital. In a year, the regional health director, a pragmatic woman with shoes too practical to be vain, adopted the protocol district-wide and added a line to the budget that no one debated because they'd already seen what stable shelves and quick oxygen could do. No one applauded because the applause had long ago been replaced by new normal. If you walked by the hospital at dusk, the sodium lights gave the walls a kind of humble glow. The guard at the gate, still the same man, still with the same tired kindness, sometimes hummed and sometimes leaned on the iron a bit, and sometimes told a story to the little ones who liked to listen. He spoke about a morning when a boy couldn't breathe, and papers were louder than lungs, and about the day a man in a khaki shirt came and changed the order of things with a sentence that made cashiers lighter and nurses taller. He never used the word hero. He pointed at the hinge and said, "Listen, that's the sound a good door makes." Then he waved someone through without asking a question because he didn't need to anymore. The habit had learned the lesson better than any of them. The gate remembered it was a door. The ledger learned to count what mattered. And breath, once again, came first. As the screen fades to the quiet hum of a corridor finally at peace, let's carry this lesson forward. Doors can open, ledgers can serve, and breath must always come first. Thank you for walking this road with us. If you liked the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe, and we'll keep telling the stories that turn policy into everyday mercy.